I have a grim dark D&D game coming up, and I'm going to need some dire creatures for it. Now, I would normally stick to things like dire wolves, as those are typically found in D&D. However, I wanted to go with something a little abnormal. Dire boars. So, I really was looking forward to painting this miniature, and then my airbrush decided it was going to die. So I knew my airbrush needed to be cleaned out. It had been a while since I had done so, and I had used the airbrush the day before, and I didn't really clean it out. I ran some cleaner through it, and I ran it till it ran clear, but that's not really taking it apart and cleaning it properly. If you've seen my airbrush care video, you'll know what I'm talking about. I really recommend taking it apart almost every single time you use it, even though I don't tend to do that. I have these ways that I kind of thin my paints out that allow me to not have to clean it and take it apart as often. You can see I really struggled getting the needle out of there, which you shouldn't really struggle with. If you took it apart and cleaned it every single time, you wouldn't have the issues I'm having. But that does mean that because I clean it so seldomly, I get problems where paint backflows up into the airbrush, and that can cause some really major problems, like what I'm pretty sure happened here. I say pretty sure because I ultimately don't really know what I did to fix the problem. As you can see here, I'm getting my airbrush all set up, I'm getting my paint mixed, I'm getting ready to go, and I go and try to put a little bit of backflow in the air into the cup to mix up the paint, and that's when I realized I had no bubbles. And if you're purposely trying to create backflow, you should be getting bubbles. It should act like a percolator and mix the paint for you. It's a really amazing technique that a lot of other miniature painters do, and I've learned from some good friends along the way. And then I noticed that with the compressor on full blast, and me manually manipulating the needle and pushing as hard as I could on the button, the button wasn't pressing, and there was no airflow once I got it to compress. That's really bad. So now we gotta dump all that paint out I just mixed up, which was supposed to be for 4 miniatures, and clean the whole thing out again. Now luckily, because this is fresh paint, it's not gonna be a big deal to clean out, but I'm not gonna have to clean out a part of the airbrush that I haven't already cleaned out. And the more you clean out those rubber seals, the faster they wear out, and you don't want to wear out those rubber seals if you can help it, because at that point it's so expensive to fix that oftentimes a lot of people just think it's more worthwhile to replace the airbrush. And I don't want to do that if I don't have to. So I'm just going to cut the boring crap right here and now and just say that, again, I don't actually know 100% what I did to fix my problem here. See, my IT brain just kicked in and thought, well, turn it off and on again. And I thought, well, how do you turn off something that's mechanical? I guess you take it as far apart as you can, and then turning it back on would be to just lubricate the parts and put it back together again. And I figured if it's still busted, I'm no worse off than I already was, so why not give that a try? And oddly enough, once I got it together, it worked, and I put some cleaner through it, and it worked even better, and I don't actually know what I dislodged or realigned, and I have no idea how or why it's fixed, but it fixed. It fixed. And yeah, so let's get on with the project and actually paint these boars. Alright, now that we got the airbrush working, it's time to paint this miniature like a pro. And by like a pro, I mean exactly like my favorite miniature painter, Miniac. And by that, I mean constantly putting body parts directly in front of the camera so you can't see anything. If you guys don't follow Miniac, he constantly gets his head in the way, and I constantly get my hands in the way. I will get a shot perfect the first time, exactly how I want it, and then not think about how I come back to it again, and I will just get in the way of the shot. Sorry. For a reference here, we're using Doom Bull Brown. Now, I did mix this color up from scratch because I didn't think I had any Doom Bull Brown, but I ended up finding some. So later on down the road, anytime you see me using this color, I'm actually using Doom Bull Brown. On top of this, I am layering up some XV88 in the main, and that is just to add some variety. You could really use any kind of color you want, but I wouldn't go much brighter than like a khaki color. Something along Xandri Dust is probably the most extreme that I would take this. And you will see me coming back to that XV88 and adding more and more with every layer that we add to this miniature, but I cover up less and less as I go, to the point where the last time you see me using the XV88, I'm only covering up 1 or 2 hairs instead of doing these big huge patches. Now, depending upon what you want the final skin tone to be, you've got a few options here on what washes you could apply. I'm using Reikland Flesh Shade, but you could use Agrax Earth Shade if you want more browns, or even something like Fugen Orange. If you want a really bright red, you could even go for Carroburg Crimson. Now, you'll notice that I'm not letting any of this really pool. There's a few places in the deepest recesses where I kind of allow that, but for the most part, I'm doing my best to move this wash around and get a nice even coat all over everything. Now, I do a step at the end just to add a little bit of detail with some Fugen Orange, but as long as you're using any kind of a darker wash at that stage, it should be fine. We'll talk about it again when we get there. Now, I'm just giving the tusks a little bit of color here. I'm using XV88 to start with, and then I'm using Talaran Sand to kind of bring in some brightness. Now, if you really want to take this all the way up to a bright pop of white, you can do some dry brushing, and I do that a little bit on some of the bigger tusks toward the end. I use a much brighter color. I don't quite go all the way to white, but you could go all the way to like a bleached bone color, and I think it would look really nice. And if you're not sure about how to do wet blending, like you can see me doing here in the video, you can always just do dry brushing and cover up less and less as you go. Now, depending upon how you really want them to look on the table, you can do a few different colors for the eyes. You could do black, you could do white, you could do a black glaze, you could do a white glaze, you could just paint the pupils like I'm painting, or you can paint the entire eyeball area and just really kind of goop it in there. And I think all of it would look just fine. These creatures kind of look rough and tough as they are, and depending upon how much paint you put on, it's going to get various different effects. And then you could even glaze in different colors if you want it to look like they're being controlled by magical means, or maybe even have magical aspects to themselves. For me, just a little pop of white does a really great job for most monster type creatures. Now, when it comes to the hooves and any kind of dark spots on the creature, I am using black. I'm not using anything mixed in with my black, but you could, if you wanted an off black, either mix in some grays or some blues or some greens and get some really interesting colors. It's going to entirely depend on the environment that you're putting your pigs in. If you're getting more of a forest environment, you might want to go with some more greens to kind of blend it in with the base a bit, or maybe even go with some blues to put some contrast against the base. It's entirely up to you at that point. I think black works just fine. It's a nice generic color, and it's not distracting from the paint job as a whole. And these are creatures that are probably going to get wiped off the table by my party in a few minutes anyway, so why stress out about putting a ton of detail on them? And finally, a nice little added detail that you can do is like little freckles or little pock marks or little speckles or just, you know, kind of little skin marks that you see on animals sometimes. They don't have this flat skin all the time. They have some kind of a texture or some kind of a pattern on them, especially in nature. And so I just add these with little drops of Fugen Orange all over the miniature. I go really overboard with the smaller one. This one I didn't go so overboard with, but I think it works really nicely. Now, these don't dry evenly when you do just little dots with washes like this. If you want more of an even finish and you don't want the speckled look like what I get, you may want to actually just use a little dot of actual paint instead of using a wash, and it'll turn out pretty good. You'll get a nice solid color, but you won't get the same level of translucency that I get by using a wash. And there you go, some happy little devil pig, dire pig things. Yeah, no, they turned out great. I think they're going to work great on the D&D table. I got a lot of good ideas on how I'm going to use them and get a lot of mileage out of them. For those of you who are interested in the base work, it's just texture paint, the basing paste from Games Workshop, basically, and I just thinned it out with a little bit of water so that it's not just all super goopy all in one spot. And then put a little dry brush of XV88 on there. Get our good old friend XV88 in the mix. Yeah, I think they turned out really, really great. I really like how they turned out. And for scale, I've got our little knight dude here, so you guys can see how big the big pig is. Well, anyway, that's going to wrap things up for today. Thank you guys so much for coming on in and hanging out while we painted up these boars. I actually really wanted to work on an Age of Sigmar model for my Night Hunt army. It is a 3D printed replacement for a Forge World model, and I have been putting a lot of time in on that Night Hunt army over on TikTok live streams. And every time I've just sat down, I've not had the time that I really wanted to dedicate to work on that model, which has resulted in procrastination, which is less time to work on that model, which has resulted in me doing some D&D stuff instead. The model will eventually get done. Life just is what it is. I work a full-time job and do not always have the time to work on models the way that I want to, and sometimes I'm just burnt out at the end of the day. I sit down to paint thinking I've got plenty of fuel left in the tank, and then I just burn out. Life is what it is, I guess. In any case, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you guys really enjoyed today's video. As always, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.